presentation will be about 60 minutes. We're aiming for 45 minutes of presentation plus at least 15 minutes of opportunities for you to ask Carrie questions. If you've got questions, please put them in the chat box. Hi, whoever that is, please mute your microphone. Sorry, the presentation should have about 15 minutes at the end where you'll be able to ask questions. I'll be monitoring the chat box, so feel free to pose your question in the box. If you're with us on a computer, you'll be able to also ask your question via the microphone. But please, for the moment, mute your microphones until it's time for the question and answer. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Carrie Torres, who's an assistant professor in the second language teaching program at Kapiolani Community College here in Honolulu. And she has a very relevant background for this program. She has a master's degree in second language studies, which is my department here at the University of Hawaii, and a PhD in exceptionalities and special education with a focus on language learners with disabilities, where she looked particularly at language learners with disabilities in writing and how they learn to write. So she'll be sharing some resources with you today. Take it away, Carrie.
All right, thanks, Betsy. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm really excited to be here and speak with you today, so thank you for showing up. I just want to start with a quick introduction to our interest section. As Betsy mentioned, we have a brand new interest section called Supporting Students with Disabilities in TESOL, and we are finally official. We were official in March at the last TESOL convention, so look for us on My TESOL, and we also have a Facebook page. And very soon, our first newsletter will be coming out. So if you join our My TESOL community, you'll receive that in your inbox. So hopefully I'll see some of you on that page or on our Facebook page. So what you're really here for is to talk about learners with disabilities. So let's get started. The objectives today are to talk about learner variability, specific language learners with disabilities, and to discuss a framework for writing support. So let's start by talking a little bit about writing in general. So why is writing so hard? Well, even for native speaking students without disabilities, writing can be a challenge. Writing requires a complex combination of cognitive processes. For example, writers need to attend to the topic, the genre of writing, how to best organize, how to connect their ideas, how to introduce and conclude it all. And that's a lot to keep in your head all at once. And for our English learners, we know they also have to think about vocabulary, grammar, and even potentially alphabet and spelling if they're working within a new writing system. Now, if we add a disability on top of that, we can see why our ELs with disabilities typically struggle significantly with writing. This is a lot for anybody to hold in their head. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about learners, some of their challenges, some of their strengths, and then we're going to look at a framework for breaking some of this down and making it manageable for our students. So let's take a brief look at the profiles of a few different ELs with disabilities to give us an idea of some of the variability, as well as the potential strengths and challenges that students have. We will also discuss, excuse me, potential supports that can be helpful for these students. However, every student is very different, so the information today is to give you an overview and possible insight into challenges and supports. As you're working with your individual students, you'll likely need to provide additional specific supports or other accommodations for your students' needs. So quick overview, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, which is what ensures free public education for students with disabilities and protects their rights in K-12 education, organizes disabilities into 13 categories. Approximately half of ELs with disabilities have a specific learning disability. Another 20% approximately have a speech and language impairment. And then the next three most common disabilities my microphone just got muted. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, Carrie.
Okay, fantastic. It just popped up and said disconnected and microphone muted. I'm glad you can still hear me. Okay, so back to specific learning disability. This is a disability that is present in students with average or above average intelligence. So sometimes people think of students with learning disabilities as having limited intelligence, but this is absolutely not the case. In fact, it's quite often the opposite. So that's something really important to keep in mind, that often these students with disabilities are highly intelligent. So as you may have noticed from the description, these students are also very heterogeneous. So students with specific learning disabilities may share common challenges and strengths, but they also may have very different challenges and strengths as well. So for our student that we're looking at, what this means for writing is that she needs explicit strategy instruction to support her metacognition and her understanding of the task. She also needs support with organization and task completion. Chunking her assignments, for example, using a graphic organizer and an outline, can also help her get her ideas on paper. This chunking will also reduce some of the load on her short-term memory, further facilitating the task. Also, providing clear models helps the student really understand what the expectation is, again, minimizing some of the challenge. Let's meet our next student. He is smart, interested in, and good at art and sports. He's also a newcomer who has had interrupted formal schooling, so his academic background and study skills are not particularly well developed. So he needs additional support with that. In addition, he struggles with speaking clearly and saying what he wants to say, in part due to a limited vocabulary and inaccuracies with grammar and verbs. And this is a result of a speech and language impairment. Many students with speech and language impairment experience these challenges with oral language, as well as challenges understanding written text, because the ability to process language is very closely linked to reading ability. Although this disability is defined by oral language challenges, as with reading comprehension, it can have a significant impact on writing. So as a result, this student needs specific support with vocabulary development and vocabulary choice, as well as grammar instruction and feedback to support him with his writing. Our next student is a great problem solver. She can focus intensely on topics that are of interest to her, and she's an avid reader. She is also shy and has been a long-term English learner, which means she's been receiving EL services for 5 or more years. This is often correlated to limited study skills, which is the case with this student. She also faces difficulty with communication, appropriately responding to situations, and developing relationships. Another challenge she has is processing a large amount of information at once, particularly if it's just provided to her verbally. This is a result of autism spectrum disorder. And students with this neurodevelopmental disorder are themselves incredibly diverse, hence the word spectrum, to highlight the range and intensity of symptoms that students can experience. Although highly diverse, common challenges among students with ASD also include difficulty managing ambiguity, particularly with assignments. So if assignment criteria isn't clear, this can be an additional challenge for students. They also may struggle with learning indirectly and transitioning between tasks and activities. So thus, effective instructional interventions for this student include setting very clear expectations for learning goals and processes and maintaining consistent with those. These can be facilitated with mnemonics and other memory tools, as well as setting a clear beginning and end point for activities, making sure to reduce ambiguity and presenting information visually. This can also be facilitated by outlines and graphic organizers. In addition, providing cues and counting down to transitions can really help limit the anxiety and frustration in students like this. So let's meet one more student. The last student we're going to meet today is creative, funny, enthusiastic about learning, and a great helper. He was also born in the US, like the majority of EL students, but he does not speak English at home, so he struggles academically in English, although socially he's very competent in English. He also struggles with maintaining focus, controlling his impulses and outbursts, as well as executive function. Sometimes this looks like a lack of motivation in class. However, it is a manifestation of his limited academic language and a result of his ADHD. ADHD can have a big impact on language learners in writing because writing employs all of those cognitive processes that we talked about in the beginning at the same time. And it requires focus and attention to manage the processes that result in writing. Many of the executive functions that skilled writers employ, such as task initiation, organization, time management, and short-term memory, are much more challenging for students with limited executive function as a result of ADD or ADHD. Therefore, this student needs comprehensive supports adapted to his individual strengths and challenges, which include clear guidelines, step-by-step directions, supports to help him chunk and organize ideas, such as outlines that will help him regain focus after distractions. If he's just writing off the top of his head and he gets distracted, he may have a hard time coming back and remembering what he was working on. But if he's created an outline for himself, it's much easier to go back to that outline and pick up where he left off. Also, engaging instruction is really important to help students maintain focus, and then support for starting and completing tasks, like helping organize step-by-step instructions, chunking those assignments, and visual and proximity cues to help students stay on task. So I'd like you to take just a minute, maybe take about 20 seconds to brainstorm to yourself and think about if any of these characteristics sound like students in your classroom, or if there are overlaps between the students that I described and the students in your classroom. So hopefully you're visualizing some of your students and thinking about how some of those challenges and some of those supports line up. But when we think about how diverse our students are, you may be wondering how you can organize all of those supports that your students need while still meeting their language development needs. One approach to this is to use a highly structured, strategy-based approach that sets clear expectations for students, chunks the information, and then supports the student's self-regulation. So I'm going to share a framework for you that helps to support many of these overlapping challenges that we just saw. As I mentioned in the beginning, you still may need to add individualized support and accommodations to meet your students' IEP goals. I think I just lost my...
Yeah, it looks like somebody named Diane Gray has shared shared her screen. So people, please make sure that you don't click any of these buttons that allow sharing screens and things. So Carrie, I think we're back with you now.
Okay, fantastic.
Except we can't see your screen, so I don't know.
Okay, let me see if I can share my
It says
screen.
waiting to view your. Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Sure.
I don't see the option to share my screen any longer.
Oh, it should look like a little monitor below the video camera in the control box.
Okay. I think we're back.
Yes, we're back. Good.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I just was talking about the need to pull together a framework to try to address a lot of these overlapping needs. However, with the understanding that we're still going to need to add in some individualized supports and accommodations to align with the IEP needs of our students. Also, I'm really going to focus on an overall framework for how to teach writing to learners, English learners with disabilities, with the understanding that throughout this process, language development instruction would need to be embedded throughout. Due to the time constraints and the fact that this is a TESOL webinar, I'm not going to focus on the language development aspect as much as the writing development aspect. So one framework that's a comprehensive approach to teaching writing called Self-Regulated Strategy Development was created by Steve Graham and Karen Harris, and it was developed to support students with learning disabilities in writing. This approach focuses on cognitive, behavioral, and affective challenges that students face while writing, rather than just the writing processes, which many approaches only focus on. It also is based on using explicit strategy instruction, which has been shown to have the strongest impact on writing. And SRSD has been identified as an evidence-based practice through a high number of really rigorous research studies for students with disabilities and students at risk for specific learning disabilities. Although it was designed with students with disabilities in mind, when I first looked at the framework, I saw that it really is an ideal support for English learners as well as English learners with disabilities. The way that it breaks down and chunks the information, sets clear expectations, and really scaffolds students through the process and gets them towards independence is a really solid approach that you can use even with ELs who do not have disabilities or struggling writers, as well as your language learners with disabilities. So let's take a little bit more of a look at this. So self-regulated strategy development includes explicit and interactive instruction of general writing strategies, genre-specific writing strategies, and strategies for self-regulation. This all leads to building self-efficacy and motivation in our students. And as I mentioned, it needs to have specific language development embedded throughout. And this can be done by addressing language standards or other grammar aspects that you see coming out of your students' writing. Now, this is not a program that you need to purchase. Just to clarify, it is just a framework that you can use with any curriculum, and it works at any level. It was initially designed for elementary school students, and I have used it in elementary, high school, and college settings. As you'll see, there are some graphics. I just adapt those to make them a little more grown up, and I add more rigor and deeper criteria when I'm working with the older students. So you'll see some of those differences. But it is something that you can embed in whatever curriculum and content you're using. It doesn't have to be specific language arts, and there's nothing you have to purchase for this. So step one in this process, it follows the gradual release of responsibility by supporting students to first understand what proficient writing looks like before they're asked to do it themselves. So you can first start by introducing the strategy and teaching the student expectations for the specific genre. So one way to teach students a general writing strategy is to teach them this mnemonic. We use POW, which is pull apart the prompt, organize my notes, and write and say more. We use this with elementary school students, and it helps them remember that they need to first look at the prompt, figure out what it's asking them, and then attend to that prompt when they're writing. After that, they create notes and an outline to organize their ideas, and then after that, they can write and expand on their ideas. For college students, I've added a little bit more to it because we have such a focus on editing and revising for students to get their writing up to college level. And so this, for the older learners, I use power writing, and I make it look a little more grown up. But this is to have them first plan, which is again, looking at the criteria or the prompt and breaking it down, organizing their ideas, putting those ideas into an outline, writing, editing their writing before submitting, and then after receiving feedback, revising their writing. So having students go through and memorize this, you can practice it at the beginning of each period so that they are really internalizing and understanding the different processes. Another part of step one is teaching genre-specific writing strategies. So there is a specific mnemonic for each genre. So for example, for informative writing, you can use TIDE. You can come up with any mnemonic you like, but this one tends to work quite well with students. It's very easy to remember. Works very well here in Hawaii because our students are very familiar with the TIDEs. But T stands for topic, I is important evidence, D is details to support the evidence, and E is the ending. So again, you can work with students, help them understand what this means, what the expectations are in writing, and then help them memorize this. So when they're faced with a writing task, they remember what process to go through, and they remember what they need to include. You can see here I have an elementary example and then a high school and college example. So there's more expectation in the higher level examples. So there are also mnemonics for opinion, argumentative, and narrative writing, which I'll share with you at the end if you want to see them. But continuing through the process, so again, first we teach the general and genre-specific writing strategies, and then we have them practice. So modeling, whoops, sorry, too fast. Modeling for them what this actually looks like. So model with the students, show them how you would pull apart the prompt, how you would break down the criteria. For older learners, rather than circles, the criteria is often much more dense. I have students number each part of the topic that they need to respond to. So again, reviewing those mnemonics, and then looking at what does it mean to break down the prompt and how do I figure out what I'm really supposed to write about. Also a part of step 1 and then going into step 2 is identifying the parts of TIDE, if you're doing informative text, in an exemplar. You can have students highlight, green for topic, yellow for important details, red for ending, or you can have them make notes in the margin. And then you can actually model doing what I call a reverse outline. So looking at an exemplar text and breaking those pieces apart and seeing what does a topic look like in this genre at my level, and then making notes in the graphic organizer based on the exemplar text. Teaching students to do this from an exemplar is actually the first step to teaching them how to create their own outline. I highly recommend having students really focus on using what's called caveman or texting language and not complete sentences in their notes and their outlines, because especially students who struggle with writing or who struggle to persist may get really frustrated and tired if they write all of their sentences in the outline and then have to rewrite everything again when they write their essay. Also, as they get it up into the upper grade levels, it just takes way too much time to write your whole essay on an outline and really defeats the purpose of organizing those ideas. This is a piece where they're learning how to chunk ideas before they start writing. Here's an example of what the student outline can look like at the lower and at the upper grades, with just a little bit more detail. So step 3, students still aren't writing yet, but in step 3, you can give students a pour essay. So in step 1 and 2, you had them take a look at an exemplar and identify the different parts. In step 3, you can give them an essay that's not that great, that's missing a few parts or is missing transitions or has inaccurate information. And you go through the same process of identifying all of the parts of the essay, modeling how to make notes, and then identifying what's missing and what's incorrect, and then working as a class to go back in and add in what's missing or correct what's incorrect, and then go through and revise that essay and rewrite it. And you can see 2 different examples of that here. This also works with older learners. You just would use an exemplar or a poor example that's closer to the level of what you're asking them to write. So this part of the process is really important because it's the first step to actually giving students an explicit model and instruction on what it looks like to revise an essay and how they should check their work and how they can go in and make revisions. It's much easier for students to find errors and revise somebody else's work than to do it on their own. It also shows them that clear expectation. So step 4 is where we actually start writing. It seems strange to delay it until step 4, but for our learners with disabilities and our English learners who may not be aware of what the structure of an academic text looks like or what the expectations are, it is essential that they go through that process of really understanding what it is we want them to do. In step 4, it's really an important part for the teacher to model the whole writing process from start to finish. So if you're going to have students use a source text and write from that source text, as the teacher, you can model reading through that source text, taking notes, making notes in your graphic organizer, turning the notes in your graphic organizer into a piece of writing, and then going back through and checking. Now in the older grades, in elementary, you might do this right in front of them on a piece of chart paper or on the board. In the upper grade levels, middle, high school, and college, you probably want to do this kind of like a cooking show where you have all of the pieces created and they just appear as you go along, so it doesn't take too long. But I even do this with my college students. I show them how I take ideas, put them into an outline, and turn an outline into sentences, and it's really helpful for them to see that process. Another part to modeling is modeling for students how to use self-statements. A lot of our language learners with disabilities can get really frustrated and stuck when they're writing. I'm sure many of you have experienced this. So one thing we can do is explicitly teach them strategies for how to self-regulate and reinforce themselves. So I give them self-statement sheets where they write down what they can do to think of good ideas. But in the modeling process, you can model that. So while you're modeling, maybe you pretend to get stuck and say, oh my gosh, I forget what I'm supposed to do here. Maybe I'm going to look back, I'm going to check Tide and see, oh, that's right. Okay, I need to add important evidence. And you can go through. You can also say, oh my gosh, my hand is getting tired, or I'm so frustrated. It's okay. I can take a short break, shake it off, and start again, and give them some ideas for how to check their work. This is a piece that teachers often skip because it feels a little bit unnatural for some to do that think aloud. It takes practice before you get comfortable with it for a lot of us, but it's actually a really essential part of this strategy to teach our students that they have strategies for how to persist and that they know what they can do when they get stuck. So moving along, after you model the whole process, then it's really helpful to move on and start to gradually release that responsibility. So the teacher is really leading everything. And up to step 5, this is an opportunity for now doing collaborative, but still teacher-led practice. So rather than modeling the whole process and you doing everything, you can still lead that process, but then elicit from the students what information should go into the notes, how to turn that into sentences, how to check, and they can follow along with you while you're modeling and then during this collaborative practice. So they're actually filling out the graphic organizer and they're writing, but they don't have to do it completely independently yet. You're still really scaffolding it. You can also provide additional scaffolding as needed. What you see here is a collaborative pocket chart that was done in a classroom with language learners with disabilities. And they struggled to write in the organizer. So as they came up with ideas, the teacher wrote them on sentence strips and the students put them on their pocket chart, which was in the shape of the graphic organizer. So step 6 is actually to stop and check and see how they're doing. This is an opportunity for students, again, to self-regulate and self-assess. I often have students do a pretest, do some sort of writing before I teach them the strategy. And then we do the modeling together and the collaborative writing. And then we go back and I provide them with this graph and they look at the pretest and they graph how they did. How many elements of Tide were they able to include in their essay? How many transition words were they able to use? And typically that pretest is pretty low, but the modeling and the collaborative writing we did together. So they get to fill in that graph all the way to the top. And then we can have a discussion about how much easier it is to be successful when we use these strategies. When the students move to more independence after that first collaborative writing, they can do it in small groups and then move to independence. They might not fill up that whole bar graph, but they can still see improvement from that first writing. This is also a place where you can have students set goals for the whole class. You can also then have individual goals for your language learners or your students with disabilities who may need something more specific. For high school and college students, I just use a simple bar graph. For the younger students, I use the surfboards to align with Tide. But if that looks too much like something for little kids in the upper grades, a simple bar graph works really well and actually really helps students pay attention to what they're including in their essays and what they need to include. Oops. Oh, so step 7 and 8, as you can see on the graph, oops, I went too far, are going to be small group collaborative practice, and then you're going to move the students to independent practice. At any point in this cycle, It's okay to stop and go back, just as you would using the gradual release of responsibility with anything. It's okay to stop and rewind and model again or reteach. Or oftentimes, I'll go back and I'll do another example of lesson 3 where we looked at the poor example. So if students are all really missing something, you can look at a poor example that has common errors that the students all share, and you can work through that together. And it's much less frustrating for the students to look at a poor example that you've put together than sometimes looking at their own as a class. And then you can teach them again to practice revising. So as I mentioned, there are mnemonics that you can use for all of the strategies. You can, of course, create your own as well. For opinion or argumentative writing, I use TREE. TREE is for topic, reasons, explain your reasons, and ending. You can also see that there's a high school and college version that shows students how to incorporate TREE into one paragraph or into a complete essay, and has a little bit more in-depth criteria for the students. There's also one that you can use with elementary students for narrative writing, which is www.what-to-how-to. And that can help them remember what the different parts are that they need to include in these different genres. I would not teach them all at once. Whatever genre you're working on, you can teach them that one. And then when you shift to a new genre, I would start all the way back at lesson 1, teach them what the purpose of that genre is, what the expectations are, and then talk them through and teach them that new mnemonic. You will also need to go back and forth and show them the difference and make sure that they aren't replacing one with the other, and really work with them in pulling apart the prompt or identifying that criteria to understand which type of writing they're being asked to do. So this is an example of the different levels of outlines that you can use as well. And again, you can create your own mnemonics, you can create your own outlines, whatever works for you, but this basic framework of going through and using the gradual release of responsibility to clearly show the students the expectations. What does exemplary writing look like? What does poor writing look like, and how do I fix it? And then how do I do it myself? Providing a lot of that support throughout. So I have a few examples here to share with you, just some before and after working with students and having them learn SRSD. So you can see in this first one on the pretest, the student didn't plan at all. The student didn't even think about writing an outline or brainstorming, and just went immediately to writing the essay. After the instruction, this student, and this is a language learner with disabilities, who used the outline. You can see the student wrote out tree, added in his ideas, and then even added in transitions to remind himself how to connect his ideas. And these are the pieces of writing that the student completed along with those organizers. So the first one, he said, I think space is important and to keep the planet safe. So he kind of wrote about one idea in there. In the second example, you can see the student even, starts with a transition and says to begin. And this one was about watching TV. And he said, I think watching TV. And then he goes on to describe his ideas. Oops. So you can see with this, the student is able to include more ideas and develop his ideas a lot more. So he says, I think watching TV helps children. One reason is how to make crafts and projects. Second, so the student is using all of these different transitions, and this is pretty good for second grade writing, especially for a language learner with disability. So you can see the big change there. This is an example of a 5th grader who, before working with SRSD, really only wrote one idea on the pretest on the first essay. A few weeks later, after instruction on SRSD, the student used an outline and then was able to write a much better developed essay and included 14 elements. So a topic, lots of important evidence, details to support the evidence, and an ending or a conclusion. And you can even see in some parts the student has numbered and gone back and checked to see that they have completed their work. Here's also a college example for those of you working with older learners. On the pretest, this student didn't do any planning, didn't write an outline, and had a very unfocused essay. After the instruction, the student used Tree to create an outline and then wrote an essay. This was a student who had a very hard time staying focused, and after the fact, he mentioned that it was much easier for him to get back on track when he lost focus because he had that outline to come back to. Whereas before, he would often just give up because he didn't remember what he was doing. And you can see down the side, he had his thesis or his topic, and then reason 1 and explain, reason 2 and explain, reason 3 and explain. So this made a really big difference in that student's ability to write successfully. It didn't change the fact that the student still became distracted, but that distraction became much less of a frustration and had much less of an impact on the writing. So just a little bit more research to go along with this is that there are emerging studies really showing the impact of SRSD on language learners and culturally and linguistically diverse students, including language learners with disabilities. And it's been shown to improve the organization and overall writing quality. It's also been shown to improve the quality and fluency, as well as students' perceptions of their writing. And this is really important because, as we know with many of our students, they struggle to persist and they struggle with self-efficacy. Many of our students feel like they're not good writers and they can't do it. So if we can help them understand that they can do it and help them see that they can do it and help them feel that bit of success, that goes a long way towards helping them be able to persist. It also has been shown to introduce the quality, fluency, and number of genre elements included. And again, the genre elements are just those parts that are included. For example, topic, reason, explanation, ending. And this is something that our students are often lacking because they may not realize what they are expected to include in academic writing. So when we give them these clear models, we're seeing that they are able to remember what they need to include, and then they're able to include it. There is also research out there, while not with language learners yet, but there is a lot of research that shows that SRSD, in addition to being an evidence-based practice for students with specific learning disabilities, it's also showing positive impacts with students with ADD and ADHD, as well as students with autism spectrum disorder. So this research spans elementary, middle, high school, and college. So it really has a positive impact at all of these different levels. It just takes a little bit of adapting the strategy to fit your student's particular level. As you go throughout this framework, while you're modeling, while you are identifying parts in an exemplar, identifying parts in a poor example, or helping students to write and revise, throughout the process, this is where you can embed mini lessons to help develop your students' language. So for example, if they're going to be writing something about something that happened in the past tense, right before or right after they write, you can do a little mini lesson on that and go back through and revise for that. So this framework is really helpful for our students, but we also have to remember to embed those language development components. So I just have a few additional references if you want to read more about SRSD with language learners or SRSD in general. And I have posted these slides online in case anyone wants to take a look at anything later on. So I think my time is up for now, but I am available if anyone has questions or thoughts they would like to share.
And at this point, you can either just speak up or type your question in the chat box and we'll relay it to Carrie. Carrie, if you see a question in the chat box, be sure to read it out loud because the recording doesn't capture the typed comments. So we want to be sure we get the question as well as the response.
Okay, I don't see the chat box at the moment.
It's in the little menu to the right. You should be able to see screen sharing, and then at the bottom, one of the tip down menus is chat.
Oh, okay, perfect. I found it. It had disappeared.
Yeah. So while we're waiting on questions, though, Carrie did cite the chapter she has in a book that I'm editing with Meryl Siegel from Peralta College called First Year Composition at the Community College, Empowering the Teacher, which should be coming out in spring of 2020 from University of Michigan Press. And Carrie's got a chapter that mentions a lot of these ideas and provides some other recommendations specifically for community colleges. Oh, good question. Carrie, could you put back up your slide that has the URL with your, where you got the slides? That would be great. So Anne has a question. What other writing genres besides opinion, persuasive, and informational and descriptive have you, so you showed us examples of opinion and of informational text, and I think also of narrative, but have you come up with mnemonics or other structures for additional genres or text types?
So I haven't. In Hawaii, we use the Common Core state standards for K through 12. And so I also base my college instruction off of that as a starting point. And the three genres that those standards cover are informative, for K through 5, opinion. For 6 through 12, opinion turns into argumentative, and then narrative. So those are the three main genres that we look at, or that I have looked at. However, a lot of people do compare and contrast or problem solution type of writing, but those would fall under the informative genre. And there are ways that you can adapt those graphic organizers and outlines to align with doing a compare or contrast or a problem solution. But those are the three main genres that I work with. And I saw that somebody mentioned descriptive, and that I would probably still use the mnemonic for informative. But again, if there's a specific type of writing that you're doing, you are more than welcome to create your own mnemonic. In fact, I recommend it. If there's something that you think is going to work better for your students and for your writing task, the main idea here is that the mnemonic is an evidence-based practice for helping students understand, for helping students remember what they need to include in their essay. So there's nothing specific about tide, tree, or www, what to, how to. It's not those words, it's just the idea of the mnemonic. So any mnemonic that you created would be effective.
Looks like we've got a question from Victoria saying, what about vocabulary? Do you ask students to use specific words in their writing, words from the units they've learned, low frequency vocabulary, any other ideas for helping English learners with disabilities and vocabulary?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's one of the language development pieces that I embed a lot of. I do a lot of vocabulary instruction, and I try to pull the vocabulary from the text that they're reading so that they can then turn around and use it in their writing. And I will give them usually a set number of words, maybe 5 words in the week that I want them to really focus on and try to use, even though there may be more good vocabulary. I also provide all of the students with a folder that has the mnemonic on it, and then in the inside it has a chart with powerful vocabulary words and transition words that are aligned to whatever genre that we're using. So as they're planning, I can refer them to that chart and say, when you're looking for your transition words, take a look at your chart and see if you can use any of those words. So you can also do the same. You can create a word bank of vocabulary that you think that you would like them to use or that they're going to need to use, and then refer them to that. I would do that during the notes phase, during the organizing your notes. That way the students are still planning, and then when they're writing, they're more just transferring that information and really just focusing on putting those ideas into sentences because they've already thought through a lot of their vocabulary. So kind of chunking it out in that way, I think is most helpful. You can also do a little review after, particularly with narrative. You can do a little review of certain adjectives or action verbs, and then have students revise and find where they need to add more description. And so you can give them a chart for that where they go in and add on a smaller scale. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I really like the idea also of, I've seen some teachers do good things with having students create a writer's notebook where they can put all of these kind of mnemonics and vocabulary lists and other tools together and like use tabs and color coding and stuff, so it's all at hand and they're able to go back to it whenever they're writing.
Yeah, I think the color coding really helps for students. Another thing I've done with struggling learners in the very beginning, if they're not quite ready, when I first show them the exemplar, if they're not quite ready to follow along and copy those ideas into note form, into a graphic organizer or into that outline, I've taken the exemplar and cut it into strips. And after they've highlighted it, I give them those strips and then they paste the strips into the graphic organizer. Or for my adult learners, I don't really have them paste it. I just print it out a little bit bigger and I have them organize it into just a large size outline as a group. So it makes it a little bit more tactile. And also helps break down some of that challenge for them.
Okay, so then there's a question from Sarah. Can this promote socio-emotional learning?
So it can, in the sense that you can, within this framework, and it's recommended to include a lot of self-regulation techniques. So having students understand how to set goals and then monitor those goals, and then really track their own progress, and also creating those self-statements. So let's say you have a student who gets very overwhelmed and maybe climbs under the desk when they feel like they can't do the writing or something is too challenging. You can have them specifically work on self-statements to tell them, so they can tell themselves what to do when they're frustrated. So one of their self-statements could be something like, when I'm frustrated, I can get up and take a walk to the back of the classroom, take a deep breath, and then I can start again. Or whatever it is that you're specifically trying to get that student to do, rather than that negative behavior that's impacting their academics. It also, in the collaborative portion, the beginning of this process, the beginning of the gradual release of responsibility is very collaborative. So some of your learners, you may want to do something like providing prompts and prompts and sentence frames to help the students understand how to participate appropriately and successfully in groups. So you can build in some of that learning as well. I'm not sure if that completely answers your question, but those are some of the components. And again, this is just a framework. So if there's something that you're already doing to promote the socio-emotional learning, you can add that in. This isn't something that is exclusionary. You can only do these things. If you keep this main framework and this main process, you can add in whatever additional supports you need. This is just a way to look at how to break down the writing instruction and make it manageable for your students.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Question from Matt. Any suggestions for integrating academic sources in this process?
Hi, Matt. Yes. So using academic sources, most of the writing that I do with students is text-based. And so we're always looking at sources and writing from sources. So one of the ways to do this is when you are doing the exemplars, or for example, if you're going through the process in step 4, when you're modeling the whole process, you can use your academic source and model how you would read through that. I typically have a copy. I do it up on PowerPoint for my older learners, and then I print out a copy for them so they're following along. And I read through it, and I stop and I do a think aloud if I get stuck, or, you know, I don't really get stuck, but I pretend if there's a challenging word, or if there's a concept that is important that I know they're going to need to include in their writing, I might stop and say, oh, this looks important. I think I'm going to highlight this so that I can add it into my notes later. And so I'll model the process of going through the reading, finding the key ideas, and then putting it into their, showing them how to put it into their notes. And then in the next step, when they're doing collaborative writing, you can bring in your academic source text again. And again, you're going to go through that collaboratively and then have the students try to pull out that information with your support. So this is a really good way to integrate the academic sources. I also use a process with my older learners called collaborative strategic reading. It's something that Jeanette Klingner had developed several years ago, and it's actually a really structured process of teaching students how to read critically, and they read critically in groups. And so they go through a text paragraph by paragraph, pulling out the key points in an organizer, and then talking through each paragraph and working through any difficulties. It's a pretty involved process. I've simplified it a little bit, but I find it really useful, especially for my college students who need to learn how to grapple with really dense and long texts.
So let's see, it looks like we got about time for one more. Victoria is asking, do you use mirror writing? First, students at first write with the help of the teacher following the process, and then the teacher changes the topic slightly and they do the whole process on their own.
Yeah, that's basically what this strategy does. It follows that process, but there are a few more steps in between. So first is the breaking down the exemplar text and making sure that students really understand the expectations. And then in that step 4, the teacher models the whole process. So if I'm modeling the writing process, my students still have the source text in the graphic organizer, and they're still writing, but they're just copying what I'm doing. I'm showing them how to do it, but they're going through the process. So as I move them towards independence, they're not struggling with how to fill in the graphic organizer because they've already done it. They're just focusing more on the ideas. Then there's the collaborative writing, where as the teacher, I'm guiding it, but I'm eliciting some of the information from the students. And then together, I'll fill that in on the graphic organizer, and the students all copy what I'm putting in there. So they're still copying me, even when it's collaborative, but they're generating the ideas. Then the next step after that is to move them to where they're doing that in small collaborative groups. Now at this point, you may have ELs with disabilities who still aren't ready to do it collaboratively in groups without you. At that point, when you've put your students into collaborative groups, you can pull a small group or one particular student and provide additional support or additional structure if they're not yet ready for independence. If you think the student is close, you could provide them the graphic organizer with sentence frames in it, so they're just plugging in keywords. So you can add in any of the supports that you need, but understanding that throughout this process, Some of our ELs with disabilities might not be ready for independence, even when you've gone through the whole process. And that's okay. Not all of our students are going to get to grade level by the end of this year, but helping them understand the expectation and engage in the process and do as much as they can helps get them closer and closer to independence. But absolutely feel free to still pull a small group. And even if students, oh, that was the other thing I didn't mention. As they start to get comfortable, I stop providing the graphic organizer and I have students write it on the paper themselves to get them closer to independence. And I think you saw that in some of those student samples. So you may have a student that really struggles just with handwriting. Even when you're having your other students create their own outlines, you might still provide it to that student just to relieve some of that additional challenge. So it's always okay to provide more support, even as you're gradually releasing support for those other students.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time. So thank you very much, Carrie, for preparing this webinar and delivering it to us. We will share the recording via a message on my TESOL. If you're not already a member of the Second Language Writing intersection or the Supporting Students with Disabilities intersection, you can join either or both of them through your TESOL account. And we look forward to seeing you at another webinar. We have not yet chosen a topic, but we will be announcing that as well. We ideally will have another webinar sometime before December and probably at least one more in the spring as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Carrie.
Thanks, everyone.